Paranormal Karen, she's so spooky. Paranormal Karen, funny too. Paranormal Karen, she's so spooky. Oh, and did I mention she's funny too? Yeah, cha-cha-cha.
Hey everybody, welcome to Paranormal Karen. And today, very excited, some of you heard my apology, I had to take down an episode that was fantastic with Dr. Richard Sugg. And he got back a hold of me, and we are on a different recording, and because he's over in England, right? Richard, you're in Great Britain?
Wales. I'll get in trouble if I claim to be in England, because the Welsh are still fairly patriotic about Wales. So yeah, I'm in Wales, Cardiff.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being patient and coming back. This is fantastic because everybody knows my favorite topic are fairies. And I went to Amazon. I saw something about you on the internet, went and looked you up, and lo and behold, I already have your books in my iPad as I speak, which we are going to get to those. And you have a couple that are being out for reprint. Am I right?
Yeah, thanks. I have reissued John Donne, my first book, at a much cheaper price, and I'm doing the same with a big book of mine, The Smoke of the Soul, which was a hugely interesting project, a great labor of love over about 20 years, and I've rewritten it, and it was fun kind of thinking how a trade audience might want to see this, and making me think about a lot of things differently. So yeah, The Smoke of the Soul due out later this year, a much cheaper price, and currently working on an amazing project, which I think could be my favorite book of all. And it brings in kind of every strand, really, of the different books I've done. And that's A History of Disgust. Talking Dirty, The History of Disgust is on its way.
That sounds fascinating already. And my favorite is the one about the history about fairies.
Yeah, it's perhaps my favorite at the moment, actually, of ones that exist. Yeah.
And it is such a, I don't know how else to say this, but I felt like I've looked at all the books on fairies, and there's some great encyclopedias of this and that, but yours does such a great explanation. But let's start right all the way back at the beginning. How did you find yourself in this paranormal world, sort of writing these books?
Yeah, that's the most basic question, really. I was researching my book on vampires, the real vampires, which we're going to talk about, and it was about 2012. It actually goes way back now. I could work out everything strange that vampire believers said about supposed vampires. The one thing I couldn't work out in a kind of rational, as it were, way was, what were they talking about when the vampire banged loudly on the roof, on the walls, threw things around the kitchen, threw things out of bed, defied the laws of physics in innumerable different ways, basically. And I presently came upon the poltergeist, because this is what they were really talking about. And as we'll see, fairy believers used used fairies as a kind of explanation for poltergeists as well. So very, very strange experience. So perhaps the strangest of my life, when I began talking to people I'd known for a long time about something that seemed to me absolutely improbable, if not impossible. And these people that I'd known 6, 12 years would look me in the eye and say, yep, that's happened to me. Never had I had a whisper of this from them until I nudged them in the right way. And that process was repeated time and again across the years to now. I sat on a train with somebody for an hour, just a chance meeting, pleasant talk about various things. And yeah, his friend had a poltergeist.
Wow.
So yeah, hiding in plain sight, this very, very strange question of the poltergeist. And just to add on my own kind of voyage of discovery, if you like, which is still going on very much, I spent a lot of time accepting the idea that people could cause poltergeist events through a kind of unconscious safety valve mechanism, throwing out unresolved trauma, as it were, in actual physical, dramatic, violent events, and that this is backed up by the way the events tend to happen around them only, follow them around, don't happen if they're asleep, don't happen if they're very ill or very tired, interestingly. So energy is being required here. Anyway, having got my head around this a little better and decided it was weird but human, I presently had to accept that actually, in a lot of cases, it's probably ghostly, and that ghosts are also conscious agents with conscious agendas and so forth, resembling people who once lived. So yeah, that's a brief explanation of a very long, crazy, ongoing journey, which I never looked for at all, never particularly wanted, didn't particularly like, but have adapted to over the last 7 years.
Well, it's very interesting. I actually made a note because in the poltergeist, I have never noticed that it doesn't happen when people are ill. That's very interesting piece of observation. And are you familiar with the Enfield haunting?
Very much, yeah.
I think that seemed like 2 or 3 things going on at once. There was the poltergeist activity from the girl, and then there also seemed to be something in the house, and it just seemed like a little trifecta of things going on.
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, one of the main investigators, his daughter had been killed, hadn't she, in a tragic road accident, and he wondered if that was becoming involved. It also looked as though the younger girl, I think she was younger, wasn't she? The younger sister seemed to sort of catch the poltergeist problems off her sister eventually as a kind of infection almost. And yeah, there was a ghost figure sensed or seen, and of course heard the voice a lot of the time, as well as the poltergeist stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly it's some of the most extraordinary paranormal stuff I've ever seen, and the representations of it in popular knowledge, particularly on Wikipedia, are really thin and really, don't do it justice.
Yeah, I did a whole episode on it, and I dug into like 4 or 5 different places to see, and they all kind of had a different account. But I'm fascinated where you gave me an explanation last time, which, by the way, I can't tell you how good this one sounds. So thank God we did. Thank you again. Where do fairies actually come from?
So their oldest pedigree is the start of Christianity, and the start of Christianity in terms of the Great Schism, that the bad angels, as we know, started fleeing with Satan out of heaven. And around about 100 odd years ago, people in Scotland or Ireland would tell you that this was what happened quite precisely. So you had angels fleeing out of heaven, you had fallen angels going into hell, and Christ and the Father had a quick discussion about how they're going to lose all their angels. Right, let's shut up the doors of heaven. So God shuts up the doors of heaven. And you end up with some angels in hell, some stay in heaven, and in the middle, you've got these angels that are trapped. They are on earth, they're in the sky, wherever. They can't get into hell, they can't get back into heaven. And people would very seriously tell you that these were the descendants of the fairies, that the fairies were descended from the fallen angels. And this is fascinating in so many ways. You've got running throughout very, very robust, long-running fairy beliefs, quiet heresies, things that were absolutely heretical and yet believed by people who were intensely pious at the same time, were fervent Christians, Catholics a lot of the time, but also Protestants. And you've also got that peculiarly in-between quality of the fairies. Perhaps no other supernatural being has got this quality, that they are highly ambiguous. They mirror so many qualities of the human world, and they mirror humans in the sense that, are they good? Are they bad? Are they one thing at one time, one thing at another? The fallen angels were kind of ambiguous, obviously, in a very basic sense. They'd been kind of epitome of holiness. They were led astray. They became bad. And certain people in Ireland would tell you that the fairies wanted to be saved, that they believed that they could be saved, like human Christians. Also, you've got this sense of immense power, of course, that angels are credited with for centuries. For a long time, angels weren't feminized. They were actually hyper-masculine. They would smash a rock into atoms of sand with a blow. And of course, if you read Paradise Lost, you've got this kind of superhuman space voyaging of the kind of anti-hero Satan going on. So that lingering kind of smouldering power is very important for the way that people feared and revered fairies, who were credited with the power to destroy the world if they chose.
Wow. And do you know, are they any link to, someone just told me there's some sort of connection between fairies and jinn. Has that come across?
That would probably work at a very kind of archaeological level, in the sense that I'm sure that some jinn were poltergeists. So yeah, we'll talk about the poltergeist side of it. But yeah, I think there's very much this fascinating archaeological strata where you've got ghosts, you've got fairies, you've got vampires, you've got demons and jinn. Probably they're all things that were inspired partly by actual poltergeist events, which we just, can only guess what they really mean.
And jinn also have that same sort of reputation, where there are stories where jinn are doing positive things to help people as well as terrible things.
Yeah, that's crucial. I think the thing about I'll have to look into the jinn more, but the fairy side of that is very well detailed, in the sense that, yeah, fairies are touchy. So they're not good, they're not bad, they're powerful. If you upset them, you can have bad things happen to you. And this has been borne out in a couple of extraordinary cases. A place called Denton Hall in Newcastle, or near Newcastle, aristocratic kind of stately home. And it's a very, very haunted place. There's compelling, detailed records of hauntings. A woman in a silk dress terrified the hell out of lots of visitors to the hall. Anyway, around the late 19th century, two spinster sisters, elderly sisters, lived there together, and they lived happily with what they saw as a silky or a good fairy, a friendly house fairy, as it were. So this fairy would leave them little bunches of flowers as presents. As you probably know yourself, this is kind of apporting that things drop out of nowhere, all sorts of objects in poltergeist households. They would do chores. I think they would lay the fire. They would do basic housework. So here, of course, you've got the very old traditional Irish, Scottish, Cornish, Welsh fairies doing your housework if you appease them, if you put out a saucer of bread and milk for them at the fireplace at night before everyone goes to bed. And this then had an interesting twist when Denton Hall's taken over by a new family. And we don't know a huge amount about them, but there was a young son, father and a young son. And the fairies simply didn't get on, as it's described, with the young son. So they caused poltergeist havoc, and the family had to move out. So you've got this curious kind of, here's the same thing reacting a very different way to different people, essentially. But it does seem to be a poltergeist in either case. Much more modern one, a couple called the Boltons in England moved into a new house. And this is, I think, late 20th century, certainly well after the war. They were told by the previous occupants that the house had a friendly brownie. You ought to know this, not a problem, but it does chores for us. It opens the windows if it's too hot and so forth. And soon enough, they realized something was there. So this childless couple, that is, they didn't have any kids who were going to hoax on them, found that, tasks were done. Things were tidied up. And I think laundry was actually done, I believe, in the washing machine.
Wow.
I could come to an accommodation with this demon, I think, at home. It folded things up. Anyway, people have their own kind of systems of tidiness, of course. So the wife presently got quite angry with finding something tidied away in a very odd place when she was looking for it in the kitchen, swore, shouted, something of this kind, lost her temper. And that night, there was such a storm of poltergeist havoc, things thrown around and stuff rubbed into the carpet, that they simply fled. I think they called the police and they spent the night at a hotel. Third kind of litmus test for this single brownie or whatever it was the next set of people got on with it fine, I believe. There was another set of residents after the Boltons, and they got the friendly version. So what you get with the fairy poltergeist is the fairies fit that way that poltergeists can be friendly, benign, or terrifying and violent. And of course, there's a whole spectrum really of kind of silly mischief childish kind of pranks in between, basically. So fairies, way back, it goes back, I think, to Roman times, that sense that fairies will tilt either way, in either direction. And the poltergeist fairy thing is very neat in that sense.
Again, like humans, I also notice it seems like, and I'm going to use the word contract for lack of a better term, that when you have a contract with them, which is we leave you bread and water and you do this, you do not break that contract.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, another angle to that is a much more human one, which is, you probably know the folklore of, you have a friendly fairy that does work for you in the barn. It's slightly different, but it's farmhouse, and they do threshing, they do particular chores, and it's a heavy time of year for particular work, and the fairies pitch in, or the fairy pitches in. Anyway, the story goes that this happens, for some time, months, years, and then the fairy always lives in the barn, and one winter, it's very, very cold. The farmer's wife takes pity and puts an extra blanket or blankets out for the fairy in the barn and disappears, never seen again. Sometimes it will sort of shout indignantly something or other, some sort of folklore rhyme. But the point is that it seems to hate its routine being disrupted, even if it's a product of kindness. What hit me after looking at this time and again and sort of scratching my head about it was, that is how a very autistic person would behave if you disrupt their routine. So Benji, famously in The Sound and the Fury, when you drive him the wrong way around the square, he goes crazy. And the Rain Man character of Dustin Hoffman, again, can't cope with a disruption of routine. So I think it's likely that in times when disability was a very tricky thing and people could actually die through being physically or mentally unusual in these quite, to be honest, primitive societies, you were kind of making a convenient bargain to do some work, get some food, shelter, keep out of sight of more populous and perhaps dangerous areas. And yet you were autistic and you reacted in kind if you had your routine changed. So there is a kind of interesting human sort of socio-cultural dimension to this, I think, that sometimes these were real people who were seen in quite a superstitious way. And in a few cases in Scotland particularly, there were fairy boys who just lived in the wild. They were kind of almost real green men, claimed to go around in clothes of leaves. Somebody tried to hunt one of them once, and they lived this kind of ambiguous existence in the spaces between myth and reality, if you like. And perhaps they were better off in some cases living in the wild as possibly mentally handicapped, mentally ill people than they'd be in asylums or mured up in appalling conditions by their relatives, which mad people were in the 19th century.
My friend, that's a demonologist. I've had him on the show. Everybody knows Tommy. He's very wary of fairies. He says they can be enormous trouble. He would probably he thinks they're pretty one of the biggest troublemakers around. When you get a fairy, it can be trouble. And I know I had a fairy. We were fooling around with a fairy spell here one night, and we did a exchange with a fairy where we left the fairy chocolate. And I had no idea I was supposed to continue to leave that chocolate. And I didn't quite have the poltergeist activity, but I did have I felt like I was having a telepathic communication with it. And I got very, very angry. So it sort of goes around the line of fairy attachment, like it got attached to me. And I changed a lot and got very, very negative. But I always remember I didn't even, like I said, I did not know I was in that contract where it just made it, Tommy kind of picked it up right away. He was like, that's kind of what can happen when you do a fairy spell.
Yeah, it's intriguing, isn't it? Because I think with poltergeists and ghosts, there's a whole kind of actual
system.
Yeah, otherworldly society, if you like, with all its own different qualities, types, personalities, and so on. And one thing I think that Hollywood has misled us about is that these demonic apocalyptic scenarios of exorcism and all the rest of it, heaven and hell and what have you, are not really what usually goes on. There's a very few extremely violent and dangerous poltergeist cases and ghost cases which have resulted in this. They're tiny, less than 1%, I think, of known cases. The one I like as a poltergeist case, which shows you that it's just kind of mischief and sense of humor, really, is people in Preston, I think it was, north of England. It's called, Pontefract. Sorry about that. The Black Monk of Pontefract is a case that was very well witnessed, including by a local MP in the 60s. It involved as agents for the poltergeist both the girl of the family and the boy at different stages in their teenage years. And they got fairly used to it and kind of hardened to it, the family. Anyway, the sister, I think it was, of the family's mother came around. She didn't believe in much of this, although she was a very fiercely pious Salvation Army character. Anyway, the poltergeist took a dislike to her and seized hold of a large glove, a lady's kind of outsized glove, and was shaking this glove at her in the air, shaking its fist. At which the Salvation Army sister shouted, "You've got the devil in here," and began to sing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." And as she's singing this Salvation Army hymn, the poltergeist got both the gloves in the air, there's no one attached to them, and they begin conducting the music. And this is not the stuff of The Exorcist, but it's memorable and it's very hard to explain away.
Oh, that's very funny. And folks, I'm going right through. I'll take breaks for commercials after because I don't want to. This is such a great conversation. So also, and now the people in Ireland, like here in America, we're not quite fairy conscious, should I say? Because I think we've been too Disneyized with Tinkerbell and stuff like that. The pagan community is probably more familiar with fairies than others, but in Ireland, they take them very seriously.
They still do, yeah. I mean, Ireland's really the fairy epicenter. I didn't expect it to be, but it turned out that was the case for a very long time. And they still do into the 21st century. There was a controversy a few months ago, I think, about a road that kept slipping, and in defiance of all the engineering that people could do, this road kept subsiding over and over again. And there is a tradition of fairies as kind of eco-terrorists. They've interfered with electricity pylons. What else have they done?
Would that be a resistance to us changing things or putting blacktop down or stuff like that?
It's a tricky question. The other one I was trying to remember was it was a railway, actually, where they kept piling all the rubble back into the railway every night after it had been excavated in the day. That was also in Ireland. What it's about is hard to say, but a good cue is the Irish belief that you must not interfere with a fairy fort. This is an unusual shaped hill of some kind, possibly man-made in terms of actual Iron Age fortifications. A fairy fort, a fairy path, which I'll detail a bit more, and a fairy tree. The holly can be a fairy tree, so one character that had poltergeist in his house realized that he was using a broom made out of a holly bush for his fireplace. It's usually a thorn tree of some kind. Fairy thorns were sacred. There's supposed to be one on a Northern Irish golf course that causes problems still. One farmer, when he was drunk, one night in Ireland, cut down a fairy tree and was found in the morning alive, but with his head turned round back to front. So we've got a slight shade of The Exorcist there, in fact. And certainly nobody would interfere with these fairy trees knowingly. You had road crews that would refuse well into the 20th century to build a road over a fairy tree. So apparently if you look at Ireland from the air or on a map, you can see loads of roads doglegging around fairy trees. It's not a place for straight roads. And building crews for housing, again, I think it's about the 1950s, no man could be employed. You simply couldn't get it done to build near a fairy fort. The most notorious case, of course, with a fairy fort is the case of Bridget Cleary in the 1890s, where she was evidently, and this backs up what I said about standing out, she was evidently highly strung and perhaps some degree mentally ill. She and her husband were not the poorest of people in the Irish countryside. They were relatively well off in a quite nice new modern cottage. They were not the least educated people either. But a character called Dunne, Dunne, was much more of an old school fairy believer. And he particularly convinced Michael Cleary, Bridget's husband, that she had been taken by the fairies, that this strange, highly strung, disturbed woman was not his wife. And he seemed to be convinced of this. Various kind of horrible rituals of kind of semi-torture to decide if they could get the fairies out of her. Finally, he threw lamp oil over her, and whether accidentally or deliberately, it's not really quite clear, but he burned her to death, buried her presently in a shallow grave. She was found, the case came to light, and extraordinarily, the fairies more or less made legal history, because having been first sentenced to death, Michael finally had his sentence commuted to manslaughter, and lived. He went to prison, but eventually came out because it was argued that he genuinely believed she had been taken by the fairies, and certainly he went every night after her death to the fairy fort near the house with a knife, hoping for the fairies to come by in a procession and give his wife back to him.
Wow. That's the other thing. I know they're listed as shapeshifters, but I have like 2 or 3 books on fairies. One is illustrated, and the other one is I think it's the Encyclopedia of Fairies, which leads me to believe I don't know that you could even say they looked like one thing. They're all over the place, aren't they?
That's it. You've got this stereotyping, again, to a large extent through Hollywood, but then sort of sprawling out into all the kids' picture books, and indeed the whole kind of paraphernalia. If I could have patented the damn fairy and got all the money off it, I'd be very rich now. And yeah, these are miniaturized, feminized, and really are a bit of an indignity for the original robust, earthy, pagan, quite male fairy figure of perhaps about 4 or 5 foot from the old days, who's now forced to sit there covered in glitter at about 6 inches in size and wave a wand at small girls for the rest of his immortal life. So yeah, the original range, about 14 foot at the top level, down to, I think, kind of, half a finger size, sitting on a mushroom type fairy, but a huge lot of stuff in between, and fairies that look, or fairy type beings that look very ugly, fierce, unpleasant, sometimes misshapen with
sharp teeth.
I don't know about the sharp teeth. I haven't come across that much, but sort of very sharp, hooked noses, limbs where the limbs seem to be out of proportion to the body, brown in color, yellow in color, sometimes red in the face in traditional depictions. In terms of shape-shifting, also do behave like ghosts in some quite detailed sightings where they look like ordinary people, perhaps in slightly old-fashioned clothes. They might actually be dancing, as fairies are fond of doing, and they disappear in the blink of an eye. And wow. Certainly some of those look a bit kind of doubtful to us just because they're 200, 100 years old. But it was in, I think, the late 20th century, I think it was the 50s perhaps, that a man in Wales was fishing in a trout stream and casting away for his trout. Suddenly is very annoyed, because he likes to fish on his own in peace, to find an unusual character man, I think about 5 foot tall, in clothes, shirt sleeves, trousers. I think he gives the color of some of his clothes, gabbling at him and shouting, I like trout, Tommy, catch some trouts, catch him. So poor pal trying to cast away. He says, all right, give me a moment. So he's in the stream. This fairy character is up on open ground on the grass, and he turns around to get the line out of some weed, turns back 5 seconds, 10 seconds later, and this fairy character has disappeared in open ground. I mean, there's nothing anywhere for him to make an actual escape on foot more than less than 200 yards away. And the fisherman was a commander pal. He was an army man, military man, and his whole kind of no-nonsense tone comes through in this quite long account. And above all, he says, how did he know my name? He was called Tom. And this character, in addressing him in English with a Welsh accent, is constantly calling him Tommy. Some very surprising people have seen fairies. I think the last thing I expected to have to worry about when I started researching the book was fairies being real and fairy sightings. But there's a hell of a lot of convincing fairy sightings. A whole book, actually, by a great scholar called Simon Young, edited a collection called Seeing Fairies, which is a gripping read.
That's I know a comedian, and I believe he is Irish. His name is Jeremy Hutz, and he just told me of a story where he was walking through the mall and he turned around and there was a very small man, almost a green, he described him a little bit like a leprechaun with the big teeth, and he just looked at the thing and the thing kind of went, "Hey matey," or something like that, and then disappeared. And Tommy said, that sounds like a fairy that just popped in and, how are you? Maybe because Jeremy looks kind of Irish, he probably was like, "Hey, how are you?" And he just disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, urban ones, a surprising number of urban ones. Again, people's suburban houses, in big cities, you've had fairies of various types turning up. I haven't heard of a shopping centre one before, but in terms of something that was classed as a leprechaun, in fact, several leprechauns, it was more than one. There was Liverpool in, I think, about 1964. There was a major kind of child riot, really, where all the children had to be kind of herded by the police from an area in Liverpool because they were swearing that they'd seen leprechauns and were all kind of hurtling off to get a glimpse of them.
I bet when that happens, everyone is checking if there's a gas leak, if everyone's breathing something that makes them hallucinate. But I would say, yeah, children have that. They still have all their senses that are pretty sharp. And that's interesting. Well, as much as I hate to change from the topic of fairies, because it's so fascinating, tell me, so you started studying vampires.
Yes, I started originally just wanting to do a book on the great big stories, vampires, Dracula, Le Fanu, Polidori, whose anniversary falls this year, actually 200th anniversary of the first kind of aristocratic seducing vampire who kicked off in 1819. And I thought, well, I'd better find out what the real stuff is, if you like, the folklore, the kind of pagan superstitions that inspired these much later stories. And I realized that I was going to have to change my tack because there was such an incredible lot of extraordinary material in the area of folklore, which is not a term I really like. It tends to sort of marginalize and degrade what actually most people believed. The marginal stuff was official Christianity. The mass stuff was what we now call folklore. Anyway, I realized there was a whole other book in this topic, and I thought I'll do that first. So I did the real vampires and found horrific, terrifying, extraordinary things. The most extraordinary being the poltergeist, but also found that people were so terrified of what they considered to be vampires that they actually died of fear in many, many cases.
Wow, would that be a heart attack or just that's an interesting way to die?
It could have been a heart attack in a few cases. So the mechanism for dying of fear seems to be two types. That you've got something called voodoo death, very well studied among tribal societies where people believe in magic so badly that they die of a curse because this person has the power to kill them. And they simply, in that case, kind of shut down and die. They give up all hope and they go into a kind of physiological quiescence. and die in about 3 days, between 1 and 3 days, but it's strikingly over and over again, roughly the same time period. They refuse food and water. They're completely hopeless. They lie down and die, basically. They might sometimes foam at the mouth, fit in some kind. But that's the sort of slightly slower way for it to happen. And this has been seen with vampires, with witches, with witch doctors. Versions of it have been seen in the New Testament. St. Paul did it to somebody in the New Testament. This is in the Bible. Christians don't like to talk about it very much, but it's in there. And then you've got the quick one, and the quick one is called vagal inhibition. Vagal in terms of the vagus nerve, which one of the nerves running to the heart. And it's an odd one because if someone's pre-sensitized by fear to a certain event, and this can include going to the dentist, for example, they can die of fear through an overdrive to the vagus nerve. And essentially, I think you might as well call that a heart attack. I'm being a bit loose on the medical side here, but it's body going into overdrive rather than body going into shutdown. And they die in seconds, minutes. Tremendous, weird number of causes. A character who was being abused by racists in England, beating on his car, a Pakistani man. He died of what was considered to be vagal inhibition shortly after this car drove away. Little girl who got lost in the weeds, tall grass near Birmingham, I think, died of fear. Cricketers have died of being struck by a cricket ball, and it's not a straightforward kind of physical injury. So yeah, vagal inhibition, the quick one, and voodoo death, as it's called the slow one. Interesting kind of evolutionary claim about voodoo death is that it's useful potentially, so that if you're caught in the jaws of an animal, you go into what's called quiescence, this physiological kind of shutdown, and the animal thinks you're dead. And animals don't like to eat dead prey if they can get live prey. So a good self-respecting lion, jaguar, leopard, it's going to sprint off, catch something live and eat that instead. And this actually happened to the explorer Livingstone. Livingstone was caught in the jaws of a lion and he went limp. He didn't try to do it, it just happened. And lion dropped him and went off to get something more tasty. So yeah, that's voodoo death, and tremendous number of cases in the civilized world, as it were. People died of fear of ghosts and died of fear of vampires, and also, as far as we know, in the 17th century, could well have died of fear of fairies as well.
So somebody is so believing in vampires, and then something happens that perhaps isn't a vampire, but startles them and scares them so much that you can scare them to death.
Yeah, what happens actually, and this is another very interesting, genuine medical phenomenon, what happens a lot of the time, we've got real poltergeist stuff going on, we've got bodies that aren't decayed, we've got contagious diseases that are explained as vampires, but what we've also got, much more routinely probably, and it will happen to many, many people tonight, is sleep paralysis and the sleep paralysis nightmare. And this was a big voyage of discovery. Never heard of this before. And again, when I started talking to people about it, all sorts of people said, yeah, that's happened to me. I think it was 3 out of 12 MA students I was teaching Literature of the Supernatural found it had happened to them when they were kids, and there was very little information on this. They were terrified out their wits, and their parents weren't really interested in this. So what happens is this: every night you're paralyzed when you dream, during your dreaming sleep, to stop yourself acting out your dreams. If you act out your dreams in the very old days, you're lying in a cave in the open, animal has its attention drawn to you and eats you. So it's not a good idea to draw attention to yourself when you're dreaming and sleeping. You might also do yourself an injury, as people have when they've tried to act out their dreams. And they're not fully awake. You don't normally know about this. It's not a problem. It doesn't bother you. But in a number of cases, perhaps about 15, 20% of people, they wake up during this, they're completely paralyzed and they can't speak. And then the real nightmare, as it were, scenario is something coming at you from the corner of your room towards your bed, menacingly, slowly, far more evil than a mere kind of cold daylight description will imply. And people have said this to me to my face. And creeps up, gets on your bed. It's got weight. It's not an ordinary kind of, diaphanous ghost. It gets on your chest. It's crushing you, tremendous weight. You can see this in Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare, little kind of squat goblin. You can't breathe. And the actual word nightmare is thought to mean nightmare, mar meaning to crush or bruise. People have marks on them, their chests and their bodies in the morning. And the whole thing seems to go on for a long, long time, although if you were to record it and clock it, it might just be minutes. And it's the most terrifying thing that people have ever had happen to them. A soldier who fought in the Korean War in the front line for 18 months had one single nightmare attack and said it was the most terrifying experience of his life. I've had 3 only after I'd started doing the research, interestingly. And I can talk about those, but they're far from being as terrifying as things people have described.
Wow. So that's interesting, because one of the, I don't know if it was you that told me this last time, but apparently the fairies know when we're talking about them, because after we did our last interview, something did start clicking. Like my dog's nails are I can hear him when he runs across the wood floor, and I heard something clicking across the floor, and I look and he's asleep on the pillow. So I think everything hears us, but that's fascinating that you actually had 3 when you researched this, which, by the way, folks, there's your nightmare, the thing coming from the corner of the room and slowly at you. Does this sort of connect to the same legend of the old hag?
Yeah, it does. The old hag is the term for it in certain parts of the world. I think Newfoundland was a place where they use that term, and in the Allegheny Mountains, which was considered to be very primitive and superstitious in the late 19th century, you had the term hag-ridden, and somebody died of the belief that their nightmare was a local woman who was a witch attacking them, hag riding them, as it were. Various of these things could kill you, and the unifying factor was the nightmare. And certainly, when I started researching this, the ignorance about it in the most medically, scientifically affluent country in the world, i.e. America, was extraordinary. Poor kids were online asking each other what's going on. Their doctor had told them they were mad. Their parents had told them to shut up. One kid was terrified by it and found out eventually, after his mother had told him shut up, that it was a family secret. It was a dark family secret, and 2 previous members of the family had suffered from it, but it was a source of embarrassment, shame, bewilderment. And this has changed, unfortunately. There's a lot more information now, but it was pretty rough, in 2012, and worse, I think, probably when you didn't have the internet at all, as my students told me.
It's funny because sometimes Hollywood is a good thing in that it brings something to light that people. It's almost like I know the ghost shows are pretty overdone, and they're I enjoy them though, but I think they have brought a lot of attention, and people that perhaps are mediums or have things about them, they're okay saying it now. So that's one of the good things. But also, vampires don't look like the version that we see in the movies at all, do they?
No, they don't. They don't. This is down to Polidori, who invented the vampire of modern kind of culture in a way as a piece of fan fiction, funnily enough. Polidori, hero worship, Lord Byron. He was Byron's personal physician, and their relationship is summed up nicely in the exchange between them, where Polidori, in a moment of rash haughtiness, asked Byron, "Pray tell me, what is there that you can do that I cannot do?" Byron, 3 things. I can swim the length of that river to yonder shore. I can hit with a pistol the keyhole of that door, and I can give you a damn good thrashing. So poor Byron, poor Polidori, as he was known by the Shelleys, entered into the ghostwriting competition at the Via Diodati in 1816. Byron had actually started a story about vampires, got bored with it and dropped it, and Polidori finished it, as is famously known. Of course, the story also gave us, the competition also gave us Frankenstein from Mary Shelley. Polidori's version of the story he finished off was much more modest, short, not brilliant, but it's the archetype of the cold, aloof, mysterious, fascinating, enticing, aristocratic vampire seducer, Lord Riven. And you can see how it runs down to Dracula and then runs on to Twilight, and weirdly enough then runs on to 50 Shades of Grey. So you've got a very distinguished pedigree, if you like, here, because 50 Shades of Grey is, of course, fan fiction off the back of Twilight. Polidori's story was fan fiction off the back of Byron. So it's a quite neat sort of circle across 2 centuries. But yeah, if you're in your Serbian, Hungarian, Bulgarian mud village and somebody resembling Edward Pattinson, Christopher Lee or Bela Lugosi stalks haughtily by in their opera cape and their finely chiseled, pallid features, the only reason to be frightened of them is because somebody so unworldly is your distant absentee landlord whose cruelty is very much of this world, not the next. Your real vampire was shabby, bloated, blackened blue in colour. They perhaps had slightly long teeth. They're not spoken of very much. Perhaps had long nails because the gums shrink back, the fingers shrink, and so the nails and teeth look longer than they are. But they were pretty rough and rude. They were swollen with corpse gas, so that when you staked them, all sorts of disgusting smells, noises, and fluids came out, and you were warned in certain cases when staking your vampire or beheading it to cover things with a sheet, lest the blood and guts would spray out and drive you mad. Was one folklore belief, and wasn't just mad from disgust; it was literal. So no, they were also not very clever a lot of the time. The real vampires, they weren't full of grand, stylish, apocalyptic schemes for world domination. You could get rid of a vampire by asking it to mind a loaf of bread for you, or popping it in a stream and drowning it. And it was pretty carry-on stuff. A lot of the actual vampire folklore of how you destroy them. You could bottle a vampire. It was one of my favourites. You could bottle it by had to be a professional vampire bottler to do this, but you would conjure this invisible spirit into a bottle full of the vampire's favourite food, which was excrement, and then throw the bottle stoppered onto the fire, and hey presto, you've dealt with your vampire. So no staking required.
Wow, that's interesting. Bottled, I haven't seen that. Sounds like a very interesting trinket they could sell in Transylvania, vampire in a bottle. Were they really thought to be immortal, though, that they lived forever?
No, the point about death is much more basic and interesting than that. It's basic in the sense that it goes back probably to the birth of fear itself, fear that the dead weren't really dead. So we know that in the New Testament, Christ raises Lazarus. And to a lot of people around him, this was Christ's biggest miracle. It was a bigger miracle than Christ himself coming back from the tomb, because Christ, when he supposedly did that, had only been dead 3 days. Lazarus had been dead 4 days. And this is what Martha says. But Jesus, he's dead 4 days and he stinks. 2 crucial things. When you stink and when you've been dead more than 3 days, you're very dead. You're really dead, probably. So throughout history, you could be alive or dead or slightly dead. Christ was only slightly dead because he'd only been dead 3 days. And a vampire, hundreds of years later, was only slightly dead at 3 days. That is, you're holding the funeral. You're not expecting the person to walk back through the door alive. You're giving away their possessions, etc. But they're still not properly dead for actually a year. So you get 3 days, you get 40 days, during which in a lot of cases the dead person's soul is carried around earth to places where they perhaps have to make atonement, and they're carried around with an angel. And then you've got a year. And the Greeks in particular had a tradition of digging up their dead, far from kind of leaving them unprofaned in the quiet grave. They were religiously digging up the bodies and bones to check that they properly decomposed. And what the Greeks were most terrified of was a body that didn't decompose. The earth should help you decompose. And the failure to do so was horrible and was a trick of the devil. And people occasionally had their whole life stories rewritten retrospectively if they were dug up and found not to be decomposed. In one case in Greece, a woman, the most terrifying thing she ever saw, remembered it all her life. As she was a child, she saw a man who'd been taken out of the ground routinely, found not to be decomposed, and exposed by the clergy for everyone to see as a vampire, despite having lived a blameless life as far as everyone knew. So yeah, you had a very strange idea of death, and in keeping with this, when somebody died, you believed their soul was probably hovering around the house of death for about 3 days, and you would cover mirrors to stop it flying into the mirror, thinking it could get through the window. You would break windows to let it out through the window. You would cover drinking vessels so that it didn't fall into liquid and get drowned. Most extraordinary of all was the corpse door that you broke open a special entrance. You broke open the bricks to carry out the coffin, and you took the coffin to its burial place, and then you bricked up the corpse door because the vampire, the soul, whatever it was likely to try and come back in the same way it had gone out. And not being that clever, as we've established, it couldn't manage it if you'd bricked it up. So a lot of trouble. And there's a drawing of one of these corpse doors actually in Denmark, where you can see the outline. It looks like kind of window tax result, but it was not a window. It was a corpse door. So yeah, it was a lot of trouble to actually really properly die in traditional culture. Again, this was the majority view, however. It was the majority view. It was a legitimate view in the New Testament, and the straightforward sort of flick of a switch, bang, you're gone, whoosh up to heaven. No chance in the view of most ordinary people.
It's very interesting because it almost sounds more like a zombie, like what we think a zombie is now.
That's right. I mean, I was talking to an interesting character who'd written a whole novel called The Zombie Autopsies, and I think this is still due to be made into a zombie film, actually, one day. But yeah, Steve was kind of telling me, there's a vampire, and the vampire's very stylish, and there's your zombie, and your zombie is a kind of lumbering, uncoordinated idiot who, is not going to ask for a stylish menu before he digs his teeth into you. But actually, the vampire often looks a lot like the very shabby, kind of ordinary, unstylish zombie. So they kind of meet at certain points much more than you'd expect.
Yeah, we have quite romanticized them somehow.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, really, is we think these people's behavior looks odd, and some of the time it was odd and it was deadly, and if you were buried alive in Russia in 1890, it was no good banging on the coffin and getting out, because they would stake you to death as a vampire, and that happened. So it's not a world that we should romanticize backwards, but they would see us as pretty damn strange in return, that they spent a lot of money and a lot of trouble trying to fight vampires and to combat terror, and we spend a hell of a lot of money and trouble trying to be terrified. We can't really necessarily explain that to ourselves, or why, for women, the terrifying, controlling, predatory vampire figure is attractive, and it's no good fudging this. It's so attractive, it's the biggest selling novel of all time.
Yes, it's very, I agree with you on that, but I think that's why, even some women dating serial killers, I don't know what that is, but it is funny.
It's very, very strange indeed. And yeah, it's made a lot of money for filmmakers and novelists, and it looks like it will continue to do so. It's a tough one to explain, but certainly interesting kind of pivot in the whole sequence of it. Of course, it began with Polidori. It ran on through this quite amazing lesbian vampire story, Carmilla, which is highly sexualized in 1871. And the question is, when did charm stop being magic and start being personal magic? If you said a vampire is charming you, that was a very serious magical problem. And then suddenly the vampire was charming you because they were cultured, well-dressed, well-spoken, handsome, chiseled, could play the piano, etc., etc. It's that strange, odd pivot between two very different senses of a word.
That's right. Well, Richard, thank you so much. We made it. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you coming back on and letting.
Thank you. It's been enjoyable. It's been great. Thank you.
Anytime, first of all, I'm going to have a link to all your books on Amazon.
Great.
So if people are interested in fairies, the history of fairies, that I love that book. I'm going to have that definitely on top. And and the new ones coming out. Any you would like to get us excited about for the future? Yeah,
I'll send you, if I haven't already, a PDF of the cover of my newest book, actually, which is fiction, first piece of fiction. A lot of it looks like fiction because it's so strange, but this is fiction I wrote as a children's book, and I used a lot of the fairy lore, the fairy beliefs in it. It's an eco fable, and it's magical realist, if you like. It's funny. I came up with the idea of children saving some precious birds from corporate terrorists in a kind of ecological fable 2 or 3 years ago, and then Greta Thunberg and co started saving the world in their stead. So it's become oddly true. Life has imitated art, I suppose. But more modestly, it's good fun, I think, and it's going to be the first of a few, I hope, for kids.
That's great. And tell everybody where they can find you. I'll have a link to your website, and they can follow you on Twitter.
Yes. Know your own website is a motto of mine, which I don't fulfill. I think it's drrichardsugg.com. I haven't mentioned the title of the kids' book. It's Our Week with the Juffle Hunters. Juffle Hunters is a phrase to remember. Probably the Juffles are birds. But I will send you the website again if I haven't. And hopefully we can talk again about future projects at some point. It's great fun. It's really lovely.
Yes. Well, thank you again. And anytime, Richard, reach out. I'd love to hear from you. This stuff is so fascinating. And I'm so happy we got this done and it was easy. Folks, thanks. Thanks for listening to the podcast. You can follow me at paranormalkaren.com or karenrontowski.com. If you can leave me a review, a 5-star review, wherever you listen to me on iTunes or whatever, that would help out a lot. And again, thanks to Mike at Uno Rising Media. And thank you to Dr. Richard Sugg. This was fantastic.
Many thanks. Have a good weekend.
You too.